We have talked about this story before, but, as they say, the chickens eventually come home to roost. And that's what we're starting to see with the government's decision, of course, going back now over a year to limit the number of students, from international students anyway, coming and enrolling in English universities. Now, it's a story that I said we have talked about before, but now there's some numbers to put to this. And I think perhaps even more importantly, this is not even a matter of just English universities anymore. It's not just about McGill and Concordia and Bishops, because we're starting to see people in the system, including from, say, the University of Quebec at Trois-Rivières, come out and say, you know what, this decision by Quebec is going to hurt the province. Graham Carr is president and vice-chancellor of Concordia. He is on the line. Graham, thank you for your time this afternoon. And let me begin by saying that, some people perhaps hear us talking about this. We've spoken about this in the past and think this is, as I said, just, a university problem for English universities. But you're now starting to get support, and that support is backed up factually by French universities as well.
Absolutely. So, in fact, over the last few years, the real growth in registration in international students had been taking place in the Francophone sector, not in the Anglophone universities, although the perception might have been different, but the data proved otherwise. And now what we're seeing is that universities, including Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières, as you mentioned, and others, Université de Sherbrooke, are suffering because they're seeing what we have already experienced, which is a significant decline in the number of new registrations of international students.
Part of the other issue here, beyond just the time these people come here and spend time in university, is what happens afterwards, right? And by the way, for programs like research and development, where we know we're starting to lag here, how much of this decision is hurting universities?
Well, across the province, Aaron, 60% of PhD students are international students, and nearly 50% of all graduate research students are international students. That's critical for leading sectors that Quebec has been trying to develop over the years, whether it's aerospace or personalized medicine, or whether it's the digital arts, etc., artificial intelligence. We don't have enough of a population in Quebec to support the ambitions of the research sector, and therefore we need international students. And when we bring them here and they study at Concordia or elsewhere, the hope is that many of them will choose to stay and transition into industry and become citizens of Quebec after graduation.
As you describe this, I can't help but think that the government, or does the government not see that is the future here? It looks like such a short-term solution on their end to simply say, well, no, we're going to cut the numbers who can come, not realizing what they add potentially. As you said, so many of them choose to stay here, work in research here. That seems to be the part missing.
I fully agree with you, and it's been a real struggle for us to try to get attention focused on longer term. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to speak to the Chambre de commerce de Montréal Métropolitaine. I made exactly the same point, that today this looks like a university issue. Tomorrow it's going to be a business community issue, because the pathway of students that companies and financial institutions are used to recruiting, it's going to look like much different in a few years from what has looked in the past. It's going to be less diverse. It's going to be less multilingual, and I think that's going to have consequences for the development of Quebec's economy.
I do want to point to one other thing, and I know this is in the article that I just read, and what we call the French factor here, the government's sort of idea that, students coming here should be graduating when they do in French. And obviously there were rules put in place. Some of them have been, I guess, pulled back a little bit. But I read here that maybe the false perception is that all international students at French language universities graduate, at the level where they speak French. And that's simply not the case.
Well, the reality is that the top research institutions around the world, frankly, not just in Quebec, are drawing students from all corners of the world, and the predominant language of science, in particular, is English. So it's not uncommon to have students working in labs at l'Institut National de Recherche Scientifique or at Université de Montréal, etc., whose first or second language is English. I think all of the universities, including Concordia, recognize that we have an obligation to support students to learn French so that they can more easily integrate and make the choice to stay in Quebec after they graduate. But it's a false perception to assume that all international students coming to Anglophone universities are English speaking primarily, and that all graduate students or international students going to Francophone universities are French speaking. It's far more complex than that, and that diversity is part of what makes the university research community in Montreal so exciting and so distinctive.
Yeah. By the way, we should mention there are real numbers attached to this, Quebec government decision in terms of enrollment, in terms of money. Where are we at with respect to what you're seeing now? How much will this hurt universities and specifically Concordia?
Well, I'll give you an example, Aaron. So if we go back to because recall, and you know this very well, Concordia has sort of been in with McGill, the canary in the coal mine on this issue before it started to affect the Francophone universities. So if we go back to 22-23, which was the last year before the government changed the funding formula, and before the federal and provincial governments, and I have to say it's both the federal and provincial governments, reduced visas and imposed quotas, we have seen at Concordia a decline of 36% in the number of international students registered. That's almost 4,000 students in the space of 3 years. And there's a financial consequence to that. Essentially, we've lost $110 million. $95 million from the drop in registrations, $15 million from the change to the funding formula. And that essentially is the single factor that explains the deficit position that the university finds itself in right now. But the additional challenge is that when our registrations began to decline 2-3 years ago, the effect is cumulative because you lose students not for one semester or 1 year, you lose them and the funding that comes with them for the balance of their program. So it's having very grave consequences. As I said, we were experiencing this earlier than the Francophone universities are now experiencing, but it's bad news across the sector, and I think it's bad news for Quebec society and Quebec's economy. It's a bad story in terms of our image internationally. Sure. At this moment in time, we should be doing everything impossible to capitalize on what's happening south of the border, for example, and bringing in as many students, talented students from around the world as possible, in my view.
I would just ask, because I'm going to run out of time. It seems every time we talk about this, I ask you one question all the time, and that is, the government makes a decision. There's been reaction. We have numbers that now show how this is hurting, not just English, but French universities as well. Have you had additional consultations with the government? Has anybody given you an impression, an indication that something might change?
Well, last week and the week before, the universities, along with other actors in society, were invited to testify at the National Assembly hearings on the multi-year plan around immigration. So I think the universities presented a very united front in terms of the message that they conveyed. The message was the same, whether it was coming from small regional Francophone universities, large metropolitan Anglophone or Francophone universities, that the policies are hurting. It's up now to the government to take back what they heard in the testimony, and presumably you're having consultations because you want to get advice and you want to understand what the impact is. And I would hope that the government would see the damage that it's inflicting on the sector and correct those policies going forward. That's certainly what we asked for in our brief, and that's what other universities asked for in the brief as well, to eliminate the quotas, or at least make sure that the quotas did not apply to graduate students, and to facilitate the process by which students can renew their access to the Certification d'Acceptation Québécois, which is another issue that all universities have been confronting in the last while.
All right. We will leave it at that. Graham, always appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much, Aaron. Take care.
I'm Luke Wilson. Join me each week for Film Never Lies. Since retiring from the NFL, I've had a lot on my mind, and now I've got my own show. So if you're tired of lazy takes, if you want honest conversations, join us each week. Film Never Lies, available on all TSN platforms and the iHeartRadio app.